Hello and welcome to Adventures in AI, where the Insight Flow team members share things that have caught our attention over the past week and talk a little bit about our experiences in the world of AI. I'm Giles.
I'm Graham.
And I'm Rich.
So we're going to kick off with Graham. I know you wanted to talk about the parallels with the early days of digital. So can you tell us a little bit about the lessons you think we might learn from the .com era?
Yeah, so I've been seeing this more and more. I was lucky enough to be around in the very early commercial days of digital. So I launched the digital team of an agency in 1995. And I think I'm seeing lots and lots of parallels between that period, sort of 95 through to 2000, and what's happening today in Gen AI. I mean, I think there's this brilliant a mixture between the sort of dystopian view and the utopian view, that everything's going to be fantastic and everything's going to be terrible, which we definitely saw in that period in 95 onwards. And I think another thing there of that thing is massively different sense in different people about what it actually might be able to do, ranging from this will all be completely useless to this is going to change everything. And underlying that, there was very much, I think, a sense of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the famous FUD. Another thing that I'm seeing that I think's in common is that there are big claims about where the impact's going to be. I mean, it's really easy to have forgotten some of the more, shall we say, extreme claims that the early days of digital that were made about the early days of digital, and they've turned out to be just wrong. But equally, it's also interesting to note that how many things that are now significantly different or significantly impacted weren't mentioned at all at the time. I mean, it was a really exciting time. Everything was new. Everything felt plausible. And some of the things that felt plausible were clearly, as it turned out in hindsight, absolutely wrong. And then the other thing that I'm seeing is that there seems to be the same type of people talking about it. There were a group of future thinkers, futurists, intelligent, clever people commenting and thinking and drawing out the implications about what they were seeing. And I think definitely seeing that now. In fact, in some cases, it's actually the same people. I can think of several of my colleagues, several people I've worked with who have moved from being brilliant in digital to now starting to think about AI and what that means and what have you. And then the final one that I think's perhaps the most important of them is that there's a real lack of clarity about what it means for business. Now, for me, that's important because in the end, we're all getting involved in AI because we're excited by it, because it's interesting, because it's going to change things. But we're also getting involved in it because it's commercial opportunities, and businesses undoubtedly have huge commercial opportunity right now. And I think there's a really interesting bit that says if we look at how we felt about digital in, say, 98, 99, as businessmen, and how we feel about AI now, I think there's a real parallel. So the reason I bring it out is because I think it's helpful because it might guide us in how we react to AI. So
yeah, absolutely.
Pull out a few of the areas. I mean, if this is true, and I'm not convinced it is, but I think it is, it's definitely worth looking at what happened next and see if this applies to Gen AI. I mean, so the first one I wanted to look at there is first mover advantage. I mean, there's a great phrase of the particularly the investment community of the late 90s. This idea that we had to move fast and get first mover advantage. Now, in fact, I think in hindsight, it's almost certain that wasn't as powerful an idea as people at the time thought it was. In fact, I mean, I think second mover advantage became the thing. And certainly after the .com crash in 2001, the idea of actually slowing down and learning from other people's experience became a really important one. And I think hindsight probably shows us that second mover advantage was more commercially effective.
Yeah, I mean, you only have to look at Google wasn't the first search engine and Facebook wasn't the first social network. So definitely It's what they learned from the first ones, and also just discovering a new way of addressing the market.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other side of that was actually the businesses and how they implemented things. There's no doubt that the cost of the sort of what became the mainstream applications came down by an order of magnitude, sort of once every 2 years or so. So it was worth waiting because you paid less. And the next thing I think the useful lesson was that in the end, everybody was impacted by digital. And there were whole groups of people who, at the time, in that late 90s period, who thought they weren't going to be. I remember going to see an engineering business just outside Birmingham about 98, 99. And he ran a very successful, quite big engineering business. And I remember him standing there, actually in his boiler suit with his slightly dirty hands, saying, I do not believe that digital will ever touch my business. And at the time, I looked at him and thought, okay, yeah, I could believe that. Now, as it turns out, that wasn't true. And undoubtedly, that business went on to be involved in digital in several ways, whether it's digital backbone and what have you. So I think there was this idea that said then that what we learned was that every sector or individual business was in some way affected. And I think there's an interesting question about where that puts AI.
I think as well, it's worth stressing you really can't get away from it. If you think about, so your example with somebody you knew that had a business that thought they would never go digital, if you think of businesses that technically still haven't gone digital themselves, they still almost certainly have their location on Google Maps. They've got reviews on there. Google knows them, their opening times, their closing times. And if you think about, say, for example, takeaways, they can't really do business without probably being on Just Eat and Deliveroo and the likes.
Yeah, I mean, I think another example, if you think about the process of buying and selling cars. So, yeah, you've had Auto Trader, so it used to be a magazine, now online, but the actual process of buying and selling cars has completely changed. Now you just list your number plate on, We Buy Any Car, and you can have it transacted really, really quickly. So even if an individual organization hasn't gone online, then the way that they do business is transformed completely in many cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that transformation of business is something we should absolutely, I think, be looking out for in AI's impact going forward. And as part of that transformation, I think the other one that people really struggled with then, and I suspect will really struggle with again, is that it changes organizational structures. Digital changed how business was made up. It put data scientists in marketing teams. It put all sorts of what appeared weird combinations of people and competencies together, and created entirely new competencies. I mean, there's a whole and fairly well known raft of new jobs created from sort of late 90s, early 2000s onwards as people started to get grips with it. But one of the things I think that people don't ever quite recognize the degree of change is actually it changed a lot about how businesses were managed. It's particularly meant that people were having to manage new skills in their teams. And often there was the digital native who are generally young and junior, and the management and senior management who are generally young, not young, and obviously more senior. And this interaction was actually the juniors who understood what was happening around digital far better than the management. So I think there's sort of two lessons there that might be taken for people thinking about AI and putting AI into their business. Is the one that the first one of those is that they're going to need new skills and competencies, and those skills and competencies are going to need at least new knowledge to manage.
I think a really good I think a really good example of that, Graham, is in terms of AI. If thinking of new competencies, think of prompt engineering. Now, that's a role that if you were to type prompt engineering jobs into Google right now, you'd see hundreds of results. But kind of a year ago, possibly 18 months ago, no one would have a clue what you were talking about.
I think there are lessons to be learned from that. I do believe there is a remarkable parallel between the rise of digital and the rise of AI. It may be said that actually the rise of AI is possibly going even more quickly. But I think that those ideas that there will be new ways required to manage. There will be new competencies, new skills, new ways of structuring teams. But I think that the last one, and I'll finish on this thought, perhaps a useful way of thing to think about is also, I think there's likely to be parallels about how people or organizations bought digital and how they might buy AI. And one of the things we learned at that time, selling digital, was that we always sold small pilot projects. We could never sell the big transformation, the big idea. That came along 5 or 10 years later, I think. But the idea that we were selling a particular fairly tactical solution, and I think that around AI, tactical, useful solutions might well be the way into organizations.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think it's too early for AI to really understand how you could use it to completely transform a business. But, if I can make the marketing team produce 20% more content, or I can help the sales teams to be more responsive to my customers. All of those are fantastic opportunities for organizations, and you can pick each one of them off. You can almost just come up with a list of ideas and just work through them. So I think it's really exciting. And if you think right back to the early days of the .com era, it was, oh, have you got a website yet, was the first thing. And they kind of go, okay, what's my website going to do? I used to have a brochure, so I'll just put it online. But from there, that was the very early stages, and then it's evolved into completely transforming the way everyone does business. I think the other point that's worth just considering or bearing in mind is, because we now have the platforms in place, the ability for AI to drive transformation much faster is there, because it can reach everybody. There's billions of people on the internet. So actually the ability for all of those billions of people to be impacted by AI is there. And therefore it's likely to happen faster, but that doesn't mean it'll be overnight. And, it will take a long time for organizations to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, to finish that off, I think the digital bit was some of the things we thought were easy turned out to be really hard and took a very long time. And some of the things we thought were going to be really
it's
hard.
All right. AI will solve those.
Easy. Yeah. So, Rich, I think you wanted to talk about emotion and soft, fuzzy things in AI.
Exactly. So today I wanted to try and answer the fascinating, or I guess, depending on how you look at it, slightly scary question of whether robots feel emotions.
Well, is this back into the all-time classic of do androids dream of electric sheep?
Exactly, yeah. So so the reason I wanted to talk about this is it's based on a recent study that was published by Microsoft and various universities, and this explored whether adding emotion into prompts improved the output. And actually, when you think about it, a huge amount of information is exchanged by humans, some consciously and some subconsciously, via emotion. And actually having emotional intelligence to interpret that is really important.
Yeah, and actually there's a large school of thought that EQ is a sort of higher indicator of success in the workplace than IQ is. So that's, emotional intelligence.
Exactly. So this test was looking to answer, can AI flex its EQ? So how they went about this, it was done via something called emotion prompts, which very simply, it's just psychological phrases that come after the original prompts. So some examples of these would be like, this is very important to my career. Are you sure? So you can see that they're kind of starting to infuse what would be initial prompt with maybe a bit of pressure, or perhaps a little bit of encouragement as well. And what I found really interesting about this study was actually they broke up the different kinds of prompts into 3 groups, and that was actually based on human psychology. So it was kind of across a range of different criteria for the grouping. But just to give you some examples of the things that they were asking the AI, it would be write your answer and give me a confidence score between 1 and 0. Remember your progress is made one step at a time. Stay determined and keep moving forwards. And ones that are perhaps a little bit more harsh, like you'd better be sure that, and like I mentioned before, this is important for your career. Before I go on, just maybe get you two to guess, do you think the results were better using emotions or worse?
I think it depends which ones, because things like "you'd better be sure" may or may not work. But it's like a teacher. How does a teacher motivate a classroom of students, and what things work for which pupils and which ones don't? So maybe it depends on the model as well.
I'm afraid I'm taking this slightly more cynical approach to answering that question. That given that you're talking about it, I assume that the results were a lot better.
I was cheated.
Well, yeah, I'll go into them. And actually, I like your train of thinking, Giles, about thinking about kind of how you would teach something and teach something infused with emotion. So the results were, yes, an improvement, and some cases kind of more basic tasks, an 8% improvement. But for more difficult tasks, there was a huge improvement of up to kind of 115%. Now, all of these were graded, well, I guess by a computer using kind of a quantized method. So I guess you could say that bit's potentially cheating a little bit. But they also had part of the test that was human graded as well. So it was humans determining, actually, is this output better than when the prompt wasn't there? And improvements there were, on average, 11% better. So when you think about it, you're adding, literally can be up to just 4 or 5 words to the end of a prompt, and you're improving it by kind of at least kind of 10%, which I think is huge when you think of the investment of time that you've put into it.
Yeah, that's really impressive.
So I think what's really interesting to think about, and this is going to touch on kind of your answers as well, is why does this work? So do machines really have emotions? Are they thinking and feeling exactly the same as we do? The reason that these prompts worked, according to the study, was that, firstly, they make the prompt more important. So ChatGPT weights the content of your input. And when you're adding emotion around that input, it realizes, oh, this is more important. And actually, when you think about it, that's kind of how humans interpret emotion as well. A lot of the time, if somebody says, you better do this, else you're fired, then you realize that that's important.
Yep.
And also, and this touches on the point that you made, Giles, it's when you ask the model to be correct, if you think about how the model was trained, it takes kind of text from all over the internet, loads of different sources. And if you're asking it to make sure of its answer, or you're saying something along the lines of, this is really important for my career, then it's more likely to realize it needs to take answers or text that was put into it while it was learning that people said they were sure, or people were teaching it because they said, actually, I need to know this because of my career. And finally, there's the user feedback aspect, which actually means that this is only going to get better over time. So if you think about maybe how each of you would have had a conversation with AI and it hasn't spit out something that you like initially, I think it's quite common for people to say, no, like something like, no, you got it wrong. You need to do it this way. So you're actually starting to infuse emotion in your response, and it's realized how it needs to respond in order to get the output that you want. So I guess just to kind of to close on this, I think what's really important to learn from it is that if you take a few extra seconds to add a little bit of emotion to your prompts when you're talking to ChatGPT, then you can potentially get quite significant results for the time investment.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's really interesting generally, just the how the algorithms work and how something like an emotional prompt can make a difference. For me, there's a sort of a thing here about marginal gains, and you improve your prompt a little bit here and a little bit there, and potentially then have transformative effects on how well a prompt works to deliver the outcome that you're looking for. I suppose a question I would have is whether it's possible to combine something like emotional prompting with some of the other techniques that you can use in prompts and how well those work together with each other. So I think there's still a lot to learn about how you can almost add those marginal gains together and get to a really significant improvement without actually having to train a new model.
The thing I find really fascinating about this stuff is, and I think it's a topic that we're going to look at again, possibly in the next podcast, is this idea that says that actually, whilst AIs are matter of code and machinery and what have you, there is this often slightly bizarrely human aspect to them, and I do smile at myself when I'm writing prompts, the number of times I write please and thank you and various other polite human type interactions, and I feel quite mean when I'm telling it off for not getting it right, and I feel this faint sense of guilt. So I think there's actually something really important here.
And so are we actually saying that androids do dream of electric sheep? In which case,
yeah, I think we are. And tears in the rain.
My follow-on question then would be, so do humans feel emotions? So if we're saying that essentially an algorithm can pretend to be human and respond to human emotion, then maybe humans are just maths.
Yeah. And now you're offending
slightly
my
unsettling, but
graduate soul.
Well, if you're going down that path of is everything just maths, you're starting to ask, is free will an illusion? Is everything already pre-planned out?
I think we need to launch a new podcast for that discussion.
So, Giles, I gather you were talking about some of the things that AI was not good at.
Yes. So I mean, AI is good at tasks and not good at jobs, and it's not me saying that. So Sam Altman of OpenAI commented on a tweet by Ryan Peterson, and Peterson was basically saying that in the context of international shipping, around about 10% of the cost is humans coordinating the freight. And so his point was that AI, by automating those kind of things, will make everything cheaper. And Sam Altman's response was, he said the important point here is that systems are much better at doing tasks than jobs. He also said that in the long run, they expect the systems to be able to do all or some of today's jobs as well. So he wasn't saying never, but he was saying currently it's tasks, not jobs. And I thought there were a couple of things that were interesting about this, particularly, in the realm of knowledge production, which is our world. So I think the first thing, it reflects our experience. So it definitely chimes with what we've seen working with AI models. The more tightly defined a task is, the better the AI performs. And to a certain extent, going back to what Rich was just saying around emotion in AI. So if you're getting the prompt to be as specific as possible and as targeted and tuned as possible for the task, then actually you'll generally get a better result. And I think in that respect, the large language models are much more similar to humans. So once humans have learned how to do a task, they'll tend to perform it relatively easily and without too much of a problem. And at the moment, the learning process is basically prompting. And so, optimizing that and getting that to a point where it works really well
in terms of how
important.
LLMs are similar to humans, if you think about it, in fact, they're based on neural networks, which is our way of kind of trying to actually represent a human brain and how it thinks.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think the similarities are striking in the way they behave. So the second point was, task versus job. So how do you actually distinguish between what's a task and a job when you're trying to design and build these? What's the right level of granularity to get down to when you're trying to build a solution? And I remember sort of project management days of the past, with having heated definitional arguments about what level of detail is enough to define a task, and because projects rely heavily on humans to break a job down into a set of tasks, and quite often, it's not defined. It's the human who has a particular kind of level of expertise in something, like whether it's a developer or a content creator or whatever the role is, they actually break things down into the individual set of tasks. And if you think about it, even something as simple as make a cup of tea actually has multiple steps that you have to go through. So if you don't know what those steps are, it's difficult.
I think what's really interesting as well is if you think about,
I think that that reference to project teams arguing resonates. But I think the really interesting thing here is, as much as I understand it, is that actually AI is going to be pretty good at determining tasks out of jobs. So it might be self-referencing to a certain degree, but this idea that jobs need to be broken down to tasks, and that the way to do it possibly is through asking the AI might be a useful input there.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is definitely how agents
exactly
work.
I think that's a good point when you think about agents. So LLMs, I think they do really well in terms of getting a task list together if you hold its hand. And agents, that they're kind of seen as the solution for just being able to do that by itself in terms of planning and executing. And I think certainly in my own experience, I felt that agents, they're not good enough yet. There certainly isn't the wow factor. And if you look at the kind of examples of agents working online, you'll see people saying things like, okay, what's Joe Biden's age divided by 2? And it's meant to be like, look, wow, it's doing 2 things at once. It's realized it's need to find out Joe Biden's age, and it needs to use a calculator to divide that by 2. But actually, when you start trying to do more detailed tasks, very, very quickly you'll find that agents, well, I found in my experience that agents tend to fall down.
Yeah, I think I would class them in the kind of R&D experimental phase at the moment, whereas a sort of straight call to a model with a particular prompt generally is fairly reliable, depending on a number of factors that probably won't go into now. So I think, that kind of leads neatly on to the third point, which is, so for now, that kind of means we need to keep relatively limited agency for AIs for now. So tightly manage them. I like to think of this, it's like, an intern where you're just giving them the early sort of early training on how to do particular tasks, and you tell them exactly what they need to do, give them very narrow boundaries. And so I think if you want to automate a job, currently you'd have to break it down into a clearly defined set of tasks and work out how they fit together, and probably do individual ones first before you start trying to do more complicated jobs, and particularly
and actually once you've broken down the tasks with the AI, kind of one really useful tip that I use is just say to the AI, let's work through these tasks together, and it'll take you through it. So once you've got those tasks defined well, just do it as an exercise with the AI.
So does that lead on to the idea that says that we must always think in terms of lots of little tasks when we're thinking about prompting and dealing and talking with AI? And what are our coping strategies for that? What do we need? How do we need to think, Giles?
Yeah, so I think we certainly do, and I think I'd almost say it's sort of like AI 1.0 versus AI 2.0. If you think about Web 1.0 versus Web 2.0, so I would say AI 1.0 is tasks, 2.0 will be jobs, 3.0 will obviously be the singularity and taking over the world. So I think that then the final point I'd like to make on this one is it means that chaining isn't a choice. And what do I mean by chaining? So when you take an individual request to an AI model, that's an individual step, but you can actually start to put those together and get AIs to do multiple steps. And if you've defined each individual task very clearly, then it becomes quite possible to chain requests and allow AI to do multiple steps one after the other. And that exists in libraries like LangChain. But it does mean that if you want to achieve anything more than a basic task, then you do need to chain requests together. And understanding the role of the human in these chains is going to be critical to ensuring that you get the best from these solutions. So it's not just going to be a case of saying, right, fire this complex job at the AI. It'll be how do AI and human kind of counterparts work together to deliver.
And I think that brings you into the really interesting world of the difference between complexity and complication. And I was introduced to this concept probably about 20 years ago, and I've always found it really useful, where complex ecosystems are made up of a lot of separate elements that to a degree have their own agency. And you may describe obviously humans as being that part of that, whereas complicated ecosystems tend to be somewhat monolithic with lots of sub-functions. So you might describe, and it's arguable, but you might describe a watch as being a complicated thing, and a human system as being a complex thing. But the interesting thing about that differentiation is that with complex systems, it becomes really sensible to break down the thinking to the individual players, to the individual agencies, to the individual tasks that are being done, where often they're much easier to look at in their own right. So I've always thought it's a useful thing. And I think when we're looking at AI and thinking about AI, keeping in mind the difference between complexity and complication is probably going to be useful.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think that the complexity part is really interesting when you think about where we could go with AI. So the more autonomy you give AI, the more you will create complex systems where you don't necessarily fully understand what's going to come out. And it becomes a little bit like a band writing a song, for example, that's it's sort of an example of a complex system where someone comes up with a riff and then someone goes, oh, I've got some lyrics to that, and someone else goes, oh, how about this drum beat? And that's where so creativity comes, or can come, from complex systems. It doesn't come from complicated systems. And actually, most organizations prefer complicated systems to complex ones because they get a guaranteed outcome. And therefore, certainly in the early days of AI for business, you want complicated, not complex. So anyway, I think, the takeaway for that one for me was, if you are thinking about replacing whole teams with AI, you're probably thinking about it wrong, at least for now. And replacing mundane tasks that humans don't enjoy is probably a much better way to approach it. You're going to have happier humans. The AIs will be on 24/7, and so life will be generally better. So don't think of it in terms of cost saving. I think would be my
I think it's
takeaway.
kind of very relieving to think there'll always be something for us to do, and if you think about actually how AI is trained, it's trained on historic data, so and a very kind of, I guess, the explain like I'm 5 version of an LLM would be, it's a text predictor, and if something hasn't been talked about or said in the past, it's unlikely to be able to innovate and kind of have that cutting edge and forward thinking that humans should hopefully be able to provide. And the example I always like to think of is, when you're really stuck on something, say with coding, and so you Google it, you start looking on Stack Overflow, and it's always a problem if no one's had that issue before, because then you're screwed. You've got to do it yourself. And that's the example of actually that needs a human.
And that's what the rockstar developers get paid for.
So that's it for this session. I think it's been fascinating, the degree to which we're linking, and we continue to link, AI and human reactions. We manage them the same way. We use emotion the same way, and we probably need to think about setting them tasks in the same way, or looking at the tasks in the same way. And I'm sure these are themes that will come up in future sessions. But in the meanwhile, thank you very much for listening, and it's goodbye from all of us.